everyone, in this video I'm going to be showing you how to write the Russian alphabet the cursive way. So let's get started. The first letter that we have is the letter A, and I'm going to show you how to write the capital letter first. So this is the first way that you can write it. You can also write it like this. There are different versions of this particular usage, of this particular writing style. So for example, you can write it like this, which is what I do. Some people do it like this. So you go like this, and then just kind of make a little loop. But it should look something like this. Some people just write it more like that. It's not necessarily cursive, but in writing style you can come across the same kind of style. The small letter A looks like this, and this is the only way that you can write it pretty much. The big one, the capital letter A, can also look the same way, just being a little bit bigger, but the small one, this is the only way that you can do it. The big one can be a little bit more various, but normally it is something among this. So this is the letter A. Next we have the letter B, and the normal way to write it is this. Some people can write it like this, so making all these little wings at the sides. You can also find something like this with the loop. This is more of a pretty handwriting, I guess. I usually write it something like this, yeah, or like this. And the small letter B looks like this. This is the only way that you can write it. Obviously it can vary. It can be the loop, the circle here can be bigger or smaller, but it's always like letter O, and then you just add a little swirl at the top. Next up is the letter V, and so for the capital V we have this. This is how I write it and how most people write it. Another way is like this, which is the same thing as the English letter B looks like. This is V in Russian, so it's either this or this. And the small one usually looks like this. This is the same kind of like an English B, right? So they're quite similar. You can just add a little loop here to make it a little bit prettier. But this is the letter V in the small size and a big size. Next letter is G, and there are various ways to write the capital one. So the first one is this, G. Another way you can find it is this, also G. I write both of these ways. It just happens to be random. Like sometimes I will write it like this, sometimes I will write it like this. It's just up to you. The small one, however, is only like this. You can't write this in the small and say that it's letter G. It's not. So the capital one, the big one, can be both of these, but the small letter is only like this. So choose the one you like. Next letter is D. So for the D letter, this is how we write it, and this is how I write it. Sometimes people can write it like this. This is not necessarily cursive, but you can also come across this. But the most common one, I guess, is something like this. You don't necessarily have to make all of these little circles here. It can be not there, but something along those lines. For the small one, there are also two ways. The most common one is this, which looks exactly like the English G, but this is D. But another way, which is a little bit more old style, however some people may still use it, is this. So don't confuse this letter with B, which I showed before. So this is B, right? The B sound. This is D, the D sound. So they are facing a different way. But this one is not so common. I'm just telling you this because you may come across this. But this is the D that we use. So it writes like this. You make the O and then just go like this. So like G pretty much. And for the capital one, this is also the most common one. Next up is the letter Y. So there are also two ways. The first one is this, which is exactly like the English E. And another way is this, which is also exactly like the English E. You know, you can choose whatever one you like. I usually write this, but sometimes I will write this, but this is the most common one for me. And for the small letter, yeah, we write it like this. we can't duplicate that in small version. This is the only way to write yeah, and it is exactly like the English E, very simple. Letter yo, which is exactly like yeah, you just add 2 dots on top, both for the big one and for the small one. However, this letter is often just missed, and a lot of people just ignore these things and we don't write them. So this will be both yeah and yo. But if you want to be a little bit more correct in your writing, it is suggested to use these. People nowadays ignore these 2 dots a lot. Next letter is je, which can be a little bit more confusing in writing and is also confusing for me to write because basically je looks like this. So there are many different ways to write it. This is one of the ways, but you can confuse with letter t, m a lot, she as well. So what I like to do to make sure that it is actually je is write it like this. So you make a little this figure, align this figure outwards and just go like this. This is je. But some people may write it like this. But you can confuse it with other letters. So this is just something that you have to figure out, I guess, because I don't know, it's just confusing for us as well. But yeah, I like to just make this kind of line here that goes across to make sure that it's je. So it's the same thing for both capital letter and for the small letter. Next letter is z, and the capital you write like this, which is like through number 3. This is z, and the small one will be like this. So the capital one is just like 3 z, and the small one like this. Next letter is E, so there are also 2 ways to write it. The first one is this, and the second one is this. I prefer this one, but you can also come across these a lot. So this is the first one, and this is the second one. And for the small letter, it is usually like this, or like this. But they are pretty much the same. It can be just a little bit sharper or more of the rounder H. E. Next letter is letter K, so there are also various ways to write it. This is the first one. Oh, it's kind of ugly. Like this. K. It can be a little bit more fancy, which is what I write. This is how I write it most often. K. And the small letter can be both the same like this, or just a little bit more rounder. So it's either something like this, or like this. It doesn't actually have this long. You know, in English K, this part is long, right? In Russian, it's not really. It's the same height. So yeah, K. Next letter is L. So you can either write it like this, or make it just like this. I prefer this, but again, we use a lot of different types. It depends on the handwriting really, but these are the most common ways. So it's either really simplistic like this one or a little bit more fancy. As for the small letter, it is also both possible. So it would either be like this or like this. Next up is the letter M, and it's really similar to the English one. It can be like this, or yeah, more angle-ish, or it can be a bit more fancy, something like this. I usually write it this way. For the small letter M, it can be either this one or this one. Next letter is the letter N, which looks like English H. This is the first way to write it, and the way that I write it is this one. So you can either write N like English H, or you can make it a bit prettier with lots of curves, which is cursive, of course. And for the small letter, it is usually written like this. Some people might write it like this, not often. I see some people do that, but I personally just write it like this, like the small version of this letter. N. For the O, it's pretty easy, exactly the same as the English one. O, nothing unusual. Letter P. This is different. So this is how we write the p. P. So make just 2 swirls and then at the cap it can be like this though. So this is the fancy way, I'd like to call it, and the most simplistic way. They are both correct. The small letter P, however, is only written like this, pretty much. Like the English letter N. I know this might be a little bit confusing for you, but yeah. This is the capital letter P, and this is the small letter P. Next letter is the letter R, which is written like this or like this. I usually write it like this. Do not confuse it with the English P. This is not English P, this is the sound R. And the small R is written like this. So if we had the papers that was lined and we wanted to write the letter R, it would be like this. So the tail would go underneath the line. The same thing would go for the Z or for the D. They would go behind, underneath the line. And if we were to write, for example, B, V, they would go a little bit above the line. Next letter is the letter S. Very simple, just like this. Nothing fancy here. Really simple, exactly like the English letter C, S. So for the letter T, there are 2 ways to write it. The first one is exactly like the same, the English T for the capital one. But the more fancy way to write it is like this. So it is similar to the letter P. If you remember, we wrote P like this, right? P. This is the sound T. T. So this is the possible way to write it, and this is also the possible way to write it. For the small letter T, this is how you write it. Like the English letter M. I know it must be super confusing. You can also write it like this in the small version. So it could be like this. It could be like this. Sometimes, for example, I might use both of these ways to write the in one word. For example, notebook, тетрадь, I would be writing it like this. So we would have the letter T here and T here, and as you can see, I used both of these ways, and this is totally fine. You can interchange that and write it like this, or you can write it like this, or you can write it like this, and they are both, not both, they are all correct. It's just up to you how you like it. Next is the letter U, and it is quite similar to the English one. So it would be like just U with a loop or not, up to you. Or you can also write it like this, just like the English Y. And for the small letter, it would also be something like this. So again, if we were to write it in the lined paper, this tail would be underneath the line, so it would go below. So U. Next letter is the letter F, F. So there are also different ways to write it. For the capital one, like this. So you make a line and just add 2 half circles. The more fancy way is to add a little swirl on top, which is what I do. It just makes it a lot prettier in my opinion, but you don't have to do that. You can leave it out and just write it like this. And for the small one, it is also going to be like this. You might add the little swirl as well. And again, if we were to write it in the lined paper, the tail would go underneath it, beneath it. F. So for the letter H, it is very similar to the English X. So this is the capital one. You can write it like this, or you can write it like this. Both are correct. It's up to you which you write. I usually use this one, but I use this one as well. Again, this is really depends on the situation. And for the small one, it is the exact same thing, but a tiny one. So you can either write it like this, or write it like this. This is the letter H. Next up is the letter C, which is not common for the English language. C. So you make it like this and then just add a little loop. This is important. You can't leave this loop out. It has to be here. So this is the capital letter. Small letter would be exactly the same. So again, the loop. If we were to write it in the line paper, it would be like this. So the loop would be on the line here. C. Next letter is the letter ch, which you can write either like this or like this, like the number 4. I usually use this version, but this one is also existing. And for the small letter ch, this is how you write it most of the time. Kind of like the English R, you know, some people write it like this. I see, yeah, this is the letter ch. So either like this and the small letter ch. Next up is the letter sh, and we write it like this. So for the capital one, you make little like this, sh, or you can also write it like this, sh. These are both correct. So again, we have the more fancy cursive one and the more simplistic one. For the small one, it would be like this, sh. And then we have the letter sh, which is very similar. The only difference is that we add the little loop. Remember the loop from the letter C? This is the exact same loop. Don't forget about it, because you will see the difference between sh and sh only by the loop, because we don't have the loop here and we have the loop here. So this is sh, this is sh, and the small version to write the sh is exactly the same as the big one, just a smaller one, like here. So we have sh and we have sh. Next is a little bit difficult in explanation, but if you learn Russian, you know this is tвердый знак, or like the hard sign, I guess. It can only be small. You can't write it because this is not even pronounced. It is the sound that we use to make the sound around it more harder. So the word cannot start with this letter. So you write it like this. Твердый знак, the hard sign, doesn't have any pronunciation to it. Next is the letter U, which is also weird for the English language. And you write it like this. So you make this and then add this line here. It is crucial. You can't leave anything of this out. So the word in Russian cannot start with this. So you will only have the letter U within the word, and it would be small. So it would look like this. U. And then we have the soft sign, which is the opposite of this. And you know, the way to write the soft sign, which is also not pronounced, is like this. If the hard sign does have this little thing here, little twirl, the soft sign doesn't have one. Don't forget about that. Next is the letter E, and we write it like this. The capital letter and the small letter, E. Second to last one is the letter U. This is how we write it. So we draw a line here, the vertical, then the little horizontal one, and then a circle, U. And the small one would be exactly the same, just the smaller version. So here's the big U, and here's the small u. And finally, the last letter is the letter ya, and there are two ways to write it. So this is the more fancy one with this little soft curls here, and the more simplistic one, ya. This is the capital letter. The small letter would be exactly the same. So this is the cursive way and the more simplistic way, ya. And I'm just really quickly going to write all of the letters in the way that I would write them. So yeah. So here we have the entire alphabet. I hope that this video was helpful and that you learned something new. Thank you very much for watching, and I see you in the next video. Bye bye!